The envelope bore her mother's handwriting, but the air inside Ellery House no longer carried the scent of cinnamon and lemon oil. Grace stepped onto the porch, her fingers brushing the chipped frame of the screen door. The azaleas flanking the walkway bloomed brighter than she remembered, a riot of coral and violet that once made her grandmother beam every spring. Now they felt like overcompensation. The wind carried a sweetness that didn't belong to memory, but to something trying too hard to smell like it. The door creaked open just as she raised her hand to knock. "You made it," her mother said, eyes scanning her from shoes to collar, like she wasn't sure if this was the right version of her daughter. Grace gave a small nod. "Early April's still spring, right?" Eileen chuckled, stepping aside. Still spring. Inside, the living room had rearranged itself since her last visit. The sofa had new covers, beige, too clean. The quilt that once draped over the back was gone. A flat-screen television hung where a mirror used to be. It played local news with the sound off a scroll of weather updates and zoning notices sliding across the bottom. Grace caught her own reflection in the darkened screen, same coat, different eyes. Mitch shuffled in from the kitchen with a glass of sweet tea. "Still got that Subaru runs better than it looks," she said. He nodded, like that told him everything he needed to know. Dinner was set already: honey ham, deviled eggs, macaroni pie. Eileen spooned generous portions onto Grace's plate, saying nothing about how little she ate. They spoke about Iris's new granddaughter, the church bake sale, the upcoming Easter pageant. No mention of Cassidy, no mention of Grace's life in Savannah either. The silence between them didn't feel like neglect, it felt choreographed. When Grace reached for a paper napkin, a corner of glossy paper peeked out from beneath the placemat. She tugged it free. A flyer. Ellery House. Pending closing. Below, a photo of the house from the front lawn, azaleas in full bloom. The date on the footer read April 10th. Grace blinked, steadying her breath, before asking, "What's this?" Eileen turned a little too quickly. "Cassidy's been handling the details. I wasn't aware there were details." Mitch wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Market's strong. It's a good time." Grace waited. Nothing else came. Later that night, she wandered the hallway in socks, listening to the sounds of a house settling into sleep. The wooden floor beneath the rug still creaked in the same spots. She paused by the old hall closet, now filled with donation bags and old umbrellas, and then drifted into the kitchen. The overhead light buzzed softly. A stack of unopened mail sat in a ceramic bowl shaped like a cabbage leaf. She opened the silverware drawer, then the one below it. Nothing. In the back of the third drawer, behind a broken measuring cup and a box of tea her mother never drank, she found a plastic folder. It wasn't labeled, but inside was a printout from a real estate agency. Signatures. Cassidy's twice. Her mother's. A commission agreement dated 2 weeks ago. Not even a note. She stood still for a long time, the edges of the folder bending in her hands. A car passed on the street outside its headlights, sweeping across the kitchen window. Somewhere in the distance, the wind picked up, knocking against the porch post where the swing used to hang. The missing cushions, the quiet drawers, the cautious smiles, all of it clicked into place like a puzzle no one had asked her to help build. She walked to the front room and sat on the edge of the ottoman facing the muted television. The anchors mouthed words she couldn't hear, didn't care to. She whispered, "They didn't even plan to let me say goodbye." Cassidy stepped out of her white Lexus in heels too high for the gravel and a smile too wide for the truth. The air smelled like Easter ham and fresh-cut grass. Folding tables lined the backyard beneath swags of pastel bunting strung between dogwoods. Grace lingered by the back steps, a glass of lemonade, sweating in her hand, watching as Cassidy made her entrance like a politician working a crowd. She hugged Eileen with both arms, kissed Mitch on the cheek, then greeted neighbors with perfectly pitched charm. Grace barely nodded. Cassidy didn't look her way. There had been a time, high school maybe, when Cassidy's confidence still held some innocence, but that had soured around the time she won Junior Miss Somerset Hollow. Grace had been knee-deep in torts and constitutional law, while Cassidy practiced stage smiles and made her voice just soft enough to disarm. Show versus substance. One got scholarships, the other got applause. Cassidy's dress was cream lace, cinched at the waist with a gold ribbon. She wore it like a victory flag. Her hair was pulled into a side twist that looked effortless but wasn't. She tapped a spoon against her mimosa glass and called for attention. "Before we dig into Grandma Junior's famous deviled eggs," she began, voice lilting, "I want to raise a toast." The clatter of forks paused. Pastor Jim and Mrs. Iris smiled expectantly. "This house has seen generations," Cassidy continued, "and soon it'll see another. The Ellery legacy will live on in the hands of a family that loves it as much as we have." Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathering. Eileen dabbed her eye with a napkin. Mitch raised his glass. Grace didn't move. Cassidy beamed. To fresh starts. To fresh starts, a few voices echoed, though most were still chewing. After the toast, Cassidy circulated like honey on a hot biscuit, sweet and slow. Grace waited by the lemonade table. When Cassidy passed, Grace said softly, "Was I ever meant to know?" Cassidy's eyes flicked to her. "You left. That's not an answer." "You made that choice," Cassidy replied, plucking a napkin as if it were part of the conversation. "You gave up any say." Grace didn't respond. Mrs. Iris sidled up beside her a moment later with a deviled egg on a floral paper plate. "Cass has really stepped up since your mama's fall," she said, eyes fixed on the lawn. "Runs everything smooth. Paperwork appointments. Even picked new porch paint." Grace bit back a reply. The eggs were just like Grandma Junior's mustardy with a hint of dill. She hadn't tasted that in years. She didn't touch the lemon cake. The rest of brunch passed in slow-motion smiles and tight embraces. Children chased bubbles. An older couple debated whether to drive home before the rain. Pastor Jim joked about needing 2 slices of ham to make it through the service. Back inside, Grace slipped away while Cassidy gave someone a tour of the garden shed. She climbed to the attic, still warm, still dusty, still faintly smelling of cedar and mothballs. The boxes were stacked in no particular order. She passed old holiday ornaments, a broken ironing board, and a plastic tub of VHS tapes. In the far corner, she found it. A brown file box with Ellery deeds scrawled in black marker. Inside, among birth certificates and yellowed tax returns, she found what she hadn't known she needed: a deed, dated 1989, signed by her grandparents. And, stapled behind it, a 1-page amendment in her grandmother's looping script, an addendum for protection in the event of emotional hardship regarding the future of the property. Her breath caught. The room felt smaller all of a sudden. The dust in the air shimmered under a sliver of afternoon light. From outside, she heard children laughing and someone calling for a refill of iced tea. She stepped down the attic stairs, slowly gripping the folder like a handle. In the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She opened her messages, stared for a moment, then typed, "Viola McKay, still practicing." Viola McKay didn't need reading glasses, but she wore them anyway, as if respect for history required a little ceremony. The cottage smelled faintly of ginger and lemon balm, just as it had nearly 2 decades ago. Grace stood just inside the doorway, half expecting to see her younger self perched cross-legged at the corner chair, sipping tea too strong for her age and pretending to understand adult conversations. Jasmine vines curled around the front porch posts, and a hummingbird feeder swung gently in the breeze, its glass catching shards of morning sun. Inside, the space hadn't changed much. Shelves lined with law books in cracked leather bindings stood next to cookbooks and stacked recipe cards. The clocks all ticked at their own pace, each just slightly out of sync, like people who had learned to live together by respecting silence. "You kept the yellow teacups," Grace said, nodding toward the tray on the low side table. Viola looked over the rim of her glasses. "Of course. Some things aren't meant to be replaced." She poured with practiced grace. The tea smelled like something old and steady. Grace accepted the cup with both hands, fingers wrapping around its thin porcelain. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here." Viola smiled. "People think retiring from the courthouse means I disappeared. Truth is, I just stopped charging." She lifted her own cup and sipped. "Now I work for tea and decency." They sat in silence for a beat before Grace slid the folder across the table. Viola opened it without fanfare. Her fingers, still sharp, despite the faint tremble of age, moved swiftly through the pages. "Your grandmother had fine penmanship," she murmured more to herself than Grace. She drafted this herself, knew the structure. Left blanks in all the right places. Grace shifted. "I never told them I finished law school. I wanted them to ask." Viola looked up. "They stopped asking long before you stopped waiting." Grace exhaled, low and steady. "Is it enforceable?" Viola nodded slowly. "If Cassidy misrepresented your mother's cognitive state after her fall, and if this codicil was never legally revoked, then yes, you have standing. Enough to file a delay." They sat with it for a moment. Viola's clock on the mantel struck 11 3 minutes early. A soft knock rattled the screen door, and before either woman could answer it, swung open. Miles Holbrook stepped inside with a paper bag in one arm and a knowing smile on his face. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Viola waved a hand. "You're not interrupting. You're delivering sustenance. Set it on the counter." He looked over and met Grace's gaze. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Likewise," she said, standing. "You look steady," he offered. Grace's brow lifted. "That's one way to put it." Miles laughed under his breath and handed Viola a carton of eggs. "She's still quiet, but never unprepared. That's how I remember her." Grace looked down, a faint flush in her cheeks. Once the groceries were put away, Viola handed Grace a thin envelope, its seal yellowed handwriting unmistakable. "She told me to give you this when you came back, not for yourself but for the house." Grace held the envelope like something alive. Viola rose and crossed to a cabinet, pulling out another folder. This one marked with the county's probate seal. "I pulled this the day Cassidy filed the sale documents," she said. Something smelled off. Miles leaned over Grace's shoulder as she flipped through the pages. Cassidy had listed Eileen as co-signer, noting full capacity affirmed. No disclosure of the fall, no mention of the cognitive assessments. "She knew," Grace said, flatly. Miles tapped the margin. "If this is accurate, we can freeze the deal by Thursday morning." Dưới đây là chương 4 viết hoàn toàn theo dàn ý bản cung cấp. Hook và cliffhanger được giữ nguyên không lập nội dung từ các chương trước. Ngôi kê thứ 3 giống văn radio ấm áp đúng bối cảnh và văn hóa Mỹ. Độ dài 5,500 km. At 6:03 a.m., a fax machine coughed to life in Viola's study inking Grace's name across a line that could stall an entire house sale. The paper slid out with the slow confidence of a machine that had served decades and refused to quit. Grace stood over it heart steady, watching the letters of her name darken into permanence. Viola adjusted her robe and handed over a black pen like she was passing down something ceremonial. Miles was already at the desk, stapling the documentation they'd finalized the night before. Viola took the pages and slid them into a manila envelope, marked with 3 labels: codicil, supporting notes, and urgent property transfer. Freeze. Probate. 4404. She gave Grace a look that was neither proud nor soft, just sure. Outside, the town was waking slowly. Light rolled over the shingles like honey. By 6:30, they were walking into the Somerset County Clerk's office tucked between a diner that didn't open until 7 and a law firm still dark. Mr. Dean, the clerk, was already at his desk, coffee steaming beside a yellow legal pad. He looked up and smiled the way someone does when routine has been broken in the best way. "Miss McKay," he said, tipping his head with reverence. "Been a while." Viola placed the envelope gently on his desk. "This one's clean and timely." Mr. Dean flipped through the documents, nodding slowly as he read the codicil in her grandmother's handwriting. "Probate 440.4, he muttered. "You always liked the dusty statutes." "She always liked the sharp ones," Viola replied. He signed the acknowledgement and clicked the internal routing stamp. "This buys you 72 hours. The hearing will be scheduled if no formal withdrawal is submitted. I'll notify the registrar's office now." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't smile, not quite, but her shoulders dropped just enough for Miles to notice. As they exited, the morning had grown brighter. The wind picked up faintly, carrying the scent of something buttery and sweet from down the block. "Breakfast?" Miles asked. Grace nodded. At the Copper Kettle Cafe, the windows were fogged slightly, and the booths already had a few regulars sipping from mismatched mugs. A woman behind the counter greeted Miles by name and refilled their waters without asking. They sat by the window menus unopened. "I haven't been here since college," Grace murmured, running a finger along the chipped edge of the sugar caddy. Miles stirred his coffee. "You used to get toast and eggs. Extra hot sauce. Still do." He smiled and flagged the waitress. After the order was taken, Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills and some change. She tucked it under the edge of the salt shaker tip in advance, the way her grandmother always did. They ate quietly like people who knew better than to talk too much after doing something irreversible. The cafe buzzed softly, the scrape of forks, the sizzle of bacon, the low hum of a radio playing a Patsy Cline song from the corner. Grace's phone buzzed once. A message. "Cassidy, you'll regret this. They'll never forgive you." She set the phone down face first, untouched. Outside, the sun had fully crested the rooftops. Across the street, a delivery truck pulled into the post office. A woman in a straw hat loaded planters into the back of her Subaru. Then the cafe door opened. A breeze rushed in. Grace looked up and caught movement across the window. A man stood near the coffee truck parked at the curb. Hair grayer now, back slightly stooped, but unmistakable. Her father. In his hands a piece of paper. He held it like something delicate. A printed notice still creased. His eyes scanned it slowly, as if reading meant believing. Grace looked away. Through the reflection in the glass, she saw him fold it once then again. He didn't come inside. Grace looked down at her cup. She didn't move. Grace looked out the cafe window and saw her father standing next to the coffee cart, a copy of the notice in his hand. Eileen was sitting in the attic with a quilt across her lap, hands still like she'd been waiting there for years. Dust floated in slanted light from the gable window, turning the attic into something softer than Grace remembered. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dried lavender. Boxes were stacked against the wall, some split open from age. One bore the faded label Christmas, 1998. Another held old photos in mismatched frames. And there at the center of it all sat her mother, legs tucked beneath her like a girl at a sleepover, long past bedtime. Grace stepped carefully across the floorboards. "I didn't know anyone still came up here." Eileen looked up. Her eyes were pink around the rims, not red, just tired. She patted the space beside her. Grace didn't sit. "I thought we gave this away," Grace said, nodding at the quilt. Eileen traced one corner. "I kept it. Couldn't say why. But every time Cassidy tried to pack it, I'd find a reason to stop her." Grace waited. She made a lot of sense. Always has. Said sentiment was weight. Said we needed to travel light. "She's not wrong," Grace said, but it didn't sound like agreement. Eileen smoothed the fabric. Each square had a story Grace remembered that much. One came from her grandmother's Easter dress, another from a flour sack apron, and the smallest square in the lower corner had once been the collar of a dress Grace wore in second grade. She hadn't noticed that patch until now. "I have something," Grace said quietly, pulling a folder from under her arm. She knelt down and opened it on an old cedar chest. It's a copy of the codicil Grandma Jr. filed in '89, and the letter she left with Viola. She named me as the one to intervene if the house was ever at risk of being sold under pressure or false circumstances. Eileen didn't reach for the papers. She stared at them like they were photos from someone else's family. "She trusted you," Eileen said, voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew. She never said." Grace swallowed. Maybe she thought it would be clearer if it wasn't said out loud. Eileen nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Cassidy always knew how to present, to polish. You made your own shine, but never showed it." "I thought someone would ask," Grace replied. They sat with it, the silence warmer than the attic light. The door creaked open below. Footsteps fast. Cassidy's voice called up before she even reached the stairs. "We need to talk." She appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed, heels tapping against the wood as she entered. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on the folder. "So, it's true," she said coldly. "You went and made a scene. Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" "This isn't about looking," Grace said, rising to meet her sister's gaze. Cassidy laughed once, bitter. "Of course it is. It always is. You just never learned how to control the narrative." Grace opened her phone, tapped play. A recording crackled softly. Cassidy's voice, clear, crisp. "She'll just sign it," the recording said. "She's confused half the time. And if Grace finds out, well, she's not even on the title right, we'll have the money in hand before anyone realizes." Cassidy's face paled. "Where did you misses?" "Iris accidentally left her phone on during brunch," Grace said. "Picked up more than her sermon notes." Eileen finally spoke. "You used my fall." "I didn't lie," Cassidy snapped. "You were fine. You are fine." "You didn't ask if I wanted to sell." Eileen whispered. Cassidy turned to Mitch, hoping for rescue. He sat in the corner on an old wooden chair, hands folded in his lap. For the first time in days, he looked directly at both daughters. "I think," Mitch said slowly, "we need to stop pretending only one of you ever tried." Cassidy's mouth opened, then closed. Her expression cracked only slightly, but enough. Eileen let out a slow breath. I didn't see you coming home. I only saw you leaving. And that's on me. Cassidy didn't reply. Her eyes flicked toward the quilt, then to the window, then away. She turned, walked to the stairwell, and paused. Without looking back, she reached into her purse, pulled out a keychain, and dropped it onto the top step. It was never your house anyway. You just knew how to wait. The porch swing creaked under Grace's weight, and the silence felt like it belonged to her this time. A fresh coat of paint glistened on the railing, pale blue in the morning sun. Grace leaned back against the cushion she'd sewn herself, the fabric faded gold with tiny stitched lemons, Grandma Junior's favorite. The swing moved gently, a rhythm unhurried by time. A small white table sat beside her, holding a chipped teacup filled with chamomile and a folded letter from Viola. The yard had changed in subtle ways. Weeds no longer crept past the stepping stones. The hose was coiled neatly on its hook. The bird bath shimmered clean and filled. Miles had done most of it quietly, without asking what should stay or go. He was around, but never in the way. The lemon pie cooled on the kitchen ledge, a butter crust, flaking in the heat. Somewhere in the distance, wind rustled the orange blossoms. A bee hovered near the porch rail, but buzzed off, uninterested. Grace unfolded Viola's letter once more. The ink had bled slightly at the edges. Old paper, old truth. This house didn't need an heir. It needed a witness. She let the words sit in her lap. Benji appeared at the gate, a rolled sheet of paper under one arm, and a juice box in the other. "You can come in," Grace called, and he did, shy but excited. He held out the paper with two hands like an offering.
"I drew it,"
he said.
"It's your house."
But I made it smiling. She unrolled it carefully. The drawing was simple. Big yellow windows, curly smokestick trees. But the roof had a grin, and the swing held two people. One of them was wearing a dress and glasses. Grace smiled. "Thank you, Benji."
"It's perfect."
He sat cross-legged on the step, sipping juice. "Can I plant a mango tree over there, like the one your grandma had?" Her breath caught lightly. "You remember that?" Benji shrugged. "My mom said it used to smell like candy out here." Grace nodded. "Yeah, you can plant it, but it might take years to grow." Benji grinned. "That's okay. I'm staying around." Miles joined them with two mugs and placed one on the table next to hers. He didn't speak until Benji wandered toward the back fence to chase butterflies.
"You gonna stay?"
he asked quietly. Grace didn't answer right away. She looked out across the yard. The sky was wide and honest. The swing beneath her creaked again, softer now. "I'm not going," she said at last. "That's different." Later that day, she sat at the desk once used for tax forms and recipe clipping, and sent the email that would change the records for good. She officially withdrew the freeze order, but submitted a new application under the name Ellery Community Heritage Home. The title would no longer belong to any one heir. It would be preserved, publicly documented, privately cherished. She signed as director. The mailbox rattled at dusk. A single postcard waited among flyers and catalogs. The front showed a pier in San Diego at sunset. The back read, "Maybe one day I'll come see it again." Cassidy Grace didn't flinch. She carried it inside and placed it on the lowest shelf between a collection of church cookbooks and a jar of buttons. Not torn, not framed, just there. Sometimes the quietest returns carry the most weight, not in words or declarations, but in steady footsteps across a porch and a swing finally made whole. Grace didn't win back a house. She reclaimed something more enduring, a place where memory breathes and truth no longer hides. Kindness, after all, doesn't need applause. It simply needs space to do its work. Like a pie cooling on a window ledge, it waits to be noticed not for praise, but to remind us that care often arrives unannounced. And maybe, just maybe, the homes we keep say more about us than the ones we leave behind.